My talk is essentially divided into two parts. The first part is going to talk about how we sort of frame conflicts, and including this issue of the resource curse. And then the second part will look at some of the options for addressing these conflicts, looking at strengths and weaknesses, and also, if I have enough time, I may say something about training issues at the end. I want to quickly acknowledge that the work that I'm going to talk about derives in part from work that I did over a series of years with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, who was very interested in natural resource conflicts, and a couple of the publications there on the screen. And there's a lot of material available online that you can just download as PDF files from FAO. That's quite good stuff, and in some ways it's sad that they haven't quite kept up, especially the Forestry Department for years really had a marvelous program, but they declared they'd won the victory of participation and moved on to other things. And then the second acknowledgement is to the PEGASYS Collaborative Research Support Program, of which I was a part for several years in Ethiopia, and had a program with Addis Ababa University's Institute for Development Research, a marvelous project that Peter Little and Workin and Nagatu directing on food security related issues. And so I'll draw on that, but I want to acknowledge that all the views here today are my own, and all the errors and so forth. So don't blame these institutions. One of the concerns I have about the discussions of the resource curse is that it's just part of the story, that it is actually part of, I would say, a wider crisis of a highly unequal global society and economy that is supposedly running on endless capacity for consumption and production. But as we were talking a little bit yesterday about, for example, there's debates about peak oil. Have we reached the peak? These resources, are they seemingly infinite, that the more we consume, the more we're finding reserves, but how long will that last? And unfortunately, I think given this context of the world that we live in, these tremendous inequalities across and within societies, that it is really inevitable that we have denial of human rights, endemic social violence, environmental damage occurring in parts of the world, and we here are linked to it. It is not an African issue, it is a global issue. All right. And the little girl is saying to her father, tell me the fairy tale about the economy, right? I think that says a lot. Now, during our talks, many of us have cited different scholars as they say this or that, and I want to cite this old man who I got to talk with one of my colleagues, Igramu Adal, and in an Oromo community in northeastern Ethiopia. And he was telling us about, this is part of the PEGASYS food security projects, about the names they had for famines that had occurred in his area. And one of the famines was called the one that impoverishes those who were not aware. And you know, what a wonderful moral tale, not only remembering a history, but a lesson for the future, right? Because he was clear, because you know, as anthropologists, one asked, well, what do you mean by that? You want to be sure you just don't assume. And he said, look, some people saw these hard times coming, right? Severe food shortage just doesn't happen. And so some took actions, others didn't. And in hard times, the networks of sharing closed down, even though these reciprocity networks, when things rebound, they come back. But it's difficult, so you have to watch out. And I feel, yes, with our resource consumption, with the violence associated with it, these are very urgent issues that need to be addressed. But what to do, and recently I've been working on issues of climate change, and I don't know if how many of you are available with the REDD, which is reducing emissions for deforestation and degradation, which is trying to harness the supposed market power of carbon trading with providing money then that can be used for conservation purposes. And there's a UN program, and corporations have been involved in different countries. There's different things going on, and it's being sold as a win-win solution for reducing emissions, promoting resources sustainability. But this is from a publication done by critics. Instead of the REDD officially stands for, this is reaping profits from evictions, land grabs, deforestation, and destruction of biodiversity. The critics are saying this is becoming another land grab. What happens is, for example, GM will provide money to the Nature Conservancy, which will evict people out of communities. And I don't want to argue that REDD can't work, but in this context of inequality, it's very hard for genuine participation to take place without addressing these structural conflicts that exist. So it's a solution that for many people makes their lives worse. And unfortunately, those of us who've worked for many years in issues of participatory development know that this is all too common a story. Well, many of you may be aware that in the news there's been a lot of controversy about whether this new land grab, as it's being called, is occurring. Many African countries and some Asian countries are inviting investors, sometimes from within the country, a lot of time outside investors, from India, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, that come in and take basically large concessions of land, lease it for 99 years, 25 years. And this is a report done by FAO, by people at Sussex University and other places that you can, again, download on the internet, off the internet. And I would like to make the point that this new land grab is really a continuation of the old land grab, which has gone on for ages, which is that states and others have not recognized local land rights and land claims, and that rural people continue to be politically marginalized. So if we're looking at, again, this curse, well, it's not just again, it's not an isolated African thing, and it's not necessarily anything that's new. In Ethiopia, there's a photograph I took of a commons that had been turned over to outside investors for growing vegetables. And the Ethiopian government has already leased out a tremendous amount of land. Karaturi, I hope I pronounce it right, Global has rented 300,000 hectares, which I think is, according to one thing I read, the size of Luxembourg. And the Ethiopian government wants to lease out an area the size of Belgium for future development for rice, palm oil, sugar, and so forth. And this is informed by concern that this might be good for investors. African agriculture needs capital, but at the same time, what happens to the local populations that are resettled, villagized, otherwise displaced, end up as minimum wage laborers? So there's definitely winners and losers here. And one of the things that I find disturbing is it's informed of a view of rural people as not really having agency. Just as we sort of saw, as I would reinterpret the Chad case, is that the assumption is, oh yes, these people have capacity, and we're going to show them their capacity. We're going to provide this capacity. And it's very paternalistic. And part of the complication of what's going on is that this sort of new land grab, if we want to call it that, is happening in a context that's already socially complex, that there are multiple land conflicts taking place. And a colleague, Dr. Mengistu Desalegn who studied this place called Gimba, and what happened was this was a commons where households had their livestock, which was vital for their livelihoods. The government built a road through. Some people, local people said, oh, well, we should make a town. Other people burned down their dwellings, who were their relatives. So it was a tremendous fight. And well, the town people won, and a lot of women, for example, who now have shops in the town were very happy about this. But just to make it more complex, the government then took a large chunk of this commons and bestowed it to a private investor. So again, I think we have to see these land grabs are taking place in situations where people are already competing for scarce resources, making it very, very complex. All right, so what do we do about this? And there's all sorts of steps. And in my slide that you can't read, I'm telling you, it extends local to global, individual to institutional. And one of the things that just in general, I feel, since I've got the soapbox here for a second, let me perhaps preach to you, you can interpret it, is that one thing that we hear in the United States and other so-called developed countries is think about a new model of living, what Robert Chambers would have called responsible well-being in place of competitive and endless consumption. And to also shift our power priorities away from militarization. We have to appreciate we're fighting 3 wars today here in the United States, and a shift away from wealth protection to recognition of human rights, which it's not impossible to do. And you know, we don't. Why aren't we talking about the military-industrial complex curse? That to me is important. Well, there's all sorts of important steps that can be taken that we've heard about. The DoddFrank financial regulation law, which is this big law on Wall Street reform and consumer reform, and tacked on to the end of it is this concern about the selected minerals being mined in the Congo, and you have to inform on it. And this is this past week, an article from the Wall Street Journal, tech firms seek route around conflict in Congo. When you read the article, they're seeking a route around the DoddFrank financial regulation law. There's a natural resource charter that's been mentioned that was inspired by Collier's work. When I read it, I feel like I'm reading the 10 Commandments. It's so, you know, it's these good ideas isolated away from why do people act bad. But at least it's important to have them out there. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, when you go to their website, it always seems like they're more interested in, here's the best practice, here's the best case. And I think we should learn from the worst cases. I would encourage them to highlight that on their website. Agrarian reform, securing rights for people, increasing access to resources. There's very interesting books coming out on agrarian reform, and I think the notion of working with communities to increase their access to capital, technology, other resources. It's vital. And I'd have to say that what we need to do in thinking about resolving conflicts is realize there's not one way. There's many different kinds of conflicts. Some are better for some situations than others. The key is try to promote peaceful, participatory, and equitable ways of resolving conflict. I feel that rights-based approaches are absolutely crucial. Even though I've worked many times as a consultant for FAO promoting alternative dispute resolution, I'm a firm believer, and FAO, Forestry Department also emphasized, that accountability depends on legal sanctions. In this very complex case of the Ecuadorian indigenous communities that sued successfully, but now it's in appeal, Chevron, which ate up Texaco, regarding what some people have called the Chernobyl in the rainforest. It shows. I mean, this matters. If you want to get corporations to listen to you, they have to be accessible via the national legal systems. And what I've done is a chart that just highlights strengths and weaknesses of each. Let me say that it strengthens a society when you have rule of law. It promotes accountability, but of course the accessibility issue for the poor is an issue, and there's other concerns. Local practices matter. Again, we have to realize that there are lots of conflicts taking place regarding land. Not all of them involving international stakeholders and so forth. And sometimes these can be handled locally. In fact, people would prefer to do it. And so that's an option, but again, it's only for certain kinds of conflicts. And there's strengths and weaknesses. And let me emphasize that just because something is a local practice doesn't mean that exclusion of people because of gender or poverty or so forth doesn't take place. Lastly, alternative conflict resolution, sort of multi-stakeholder processes is important. This was an FAO training team, and again, there are some strengths, and especially when you have these multiple stakeholders, international NGOs and the government and so forth, corporations. This can be very, very useful, but it's very hard to eliminate the power differences, and I think we have to be, a lot of times alternative conflict resolution is a bit oversold. Last thing I want to mention is that one of the things I was involved with FAO was training people and then providing them resources to follow up and resolve conflicts locally. And these were very modest amounts of money, a few $1,000s so people could get a vehicle, they could go in the field. And it was amazing, even though these are truly modest successes, but they were successes. And if you think about the cost of a helicopter, the cost of a drone that's being sent out from Hancock Airport on our war missions, why can't we divert resources to peacekeeping? Anyway, that's the end of today's sermon. Thank you.